sturdy, so if I fall and die, you guys can split up my equipment amongst you. There's not much, but nonetheless. All right, so my name's Kyle Wilhoit. Today, I'm going to be talking about APT attribution. Yes, I am going to use the term APT, and yes, it makes me want to fucking puke. So let's keep that in mind. But it is applicable in this particular instance. Also, you might ask, why is there a man fighting an elephant? There's really no particular reason. It just seemed like a clever thing. And last night, while several of us, you guys can raise your hand, wherever you are, where are you? There we go. We decided to have a conversation with a few people and tell them that we were actually here for an elephant wrestling competition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it was a long story. So a little bit about me. Again, my name is Kyle Wilhoit. I'm a senior researcher for Trend Micro, where I research pretty much anything that comes around that I decide to break, or compromise, attribution, whatever the case is. Some of those points are accurate and valid. I do eat McDonald's fairly regularly. The naked thing, sometimes, but the Warcraft, not so much. So, sandboxing. We all know what sandboxing is. We're familiar with CuckooBox, we're familiar with Norman. All the vendors have wonderful sandboxing technologies out there. Sandbox it's great at a very high level if you're wanting to perform dynamic analysis on a piece of malware that's fairly basic. It can give you an idea of possibly C2 infrastructure, it can give you an idea of what registry edits are occurring, those types of things. It's somewhat resource intensive, but that's really not anymore a factor when you're looking at doing sandboxing. It's pretty good at mimicking environments as well, right? So Windows 7, Windows XP, all the vulnerable operating systems that you want to push out there, it can mimic those and it runs those perfectly fine with no issues. It's not very good, however, at mimicking application-specific vulnerabilities. And when I say that, I mean you can install a vulnerable application, obviously, that runs in a sandbox, but to go back and reconfigure that, and to go back and modify that, it's a very painful process and a very time-intensive process. Therefore, it's not too good at that. So, incubation. Incubation occurs when you're talking about eggs, right? It occurs when you're talking about some sort of baked good. I don't really know what those are. Found it on Google. Could be muffins, could be cookies, don't know. Also babies. Babies incubate, for lack of a better term. However, that's not necessarily malware incubation. Malware incubation, for those of you that are familiar, the term fishbowling is also similar to what malware incubation is. It allows a researcher to execute a piece of malware in an environment that mimics the attacker's target. So for instance, the best way to describe this, if you have a piece of malware that you know is targeting a large electronics company, let's say Sony in this case, and you know that by looking in the binary, you can see strings that are targeting Sony or host names or IP schemes, whatever the case is. You, with malware incubation, can set up a customized environment that looks and mimics a Sony environment. So when the attacker goes in, they think, I'm actually in Sony, I'm doing lateral movement, I'm moving around, and I'm compromising all the things that are Sony. In this case, an ideal malware incubator can mimic RFC 1918 space. It can do host naming conventions, so if it's Sony _ web server 1 or whatever the case is. Applications you can also mimic, so meaning you can push out different versions of applications that you know are vulnerable. And in this case, Word is a common one that I've been using over the past 6 months. Operating systems, right, just like any type of sandbox for the most part. Vulnerabilities that are presented based on the versioning of those applications or operating systems, you can also push out with malware incubation. VPN connections, and whenever I say VPN connections, I'm referring to outbound connectivity or the external IP that these attackers would see themselves coming out as, and we'll get into some of that as it goes on a little bit further. And then most importantly, and the most fun part, is the actual honey documents or salted documents. I'll get to that piece here shortly, but I'm also going to have to include some legal disclaimers, otherwise my company will probably fire me. So this is kind of a really cool little Microsoft Word image that I created for a 4-phase process that I consider the incubation life cycle. You have preparation occurring first, the actual incubation process second, illumination third, and verification being fourth. For the preparation phase, this occurs during the actual malware investigation piece, meaning you have the piece of malware that you've ascertained from one source or the other. You don't really know necessarily anything else about the malware other than that you have it, right? You're understanding, ideally, who the target was. The entire object is to understand who the target was. If you don't know the specific target, like Sony or Siemens, you at least want to know the area that they're targeting. Are they targeting energy? Okay, in that case, I can pick probably a company that they would be targeting. You want to know if the attack was targeted or targeted crimeware, right? There's two different methodologies of attack there. You have the traditional APT, yes, I'm going to puke when I say that, or the actual crime aspect, right? So you want to try to understand those because those actors are going to be modifying and moving and changing their techniques as they move a little bit differently. And then any additional details that you can possibly get. Is it targeting a specific operating system? Is it targeting specific versions of apps? What is it targeting? Anything you can get further. Now, incubation. Again, this picture, I don't even know, just a man with some chickens on him. It allows for the culmination, right? So it takes everything from the prep phase and allows you to start to execute that malware. You execute it in your environment, and this is the process of what I call firing up the incubator, starting it up. It allows for full forensic evidence being pulled, so you can pull memory, you can do registry shots, you can do all of the traditional things that you would do in a forensic analysis. And then it tracks all the malware's movement. We'll get into how it does that going forward. And illumination. So this phase, ideally, helps you shed light on what the attackers did and what their motivations were. You may not understand all of it at that point, but at least you have a foundational understanding. You can start to understand what tools they were using, what techniques they were using, and what tactics they were utilizing. So were they using certain backdoors? Were they utilizing certain tools to do lateral movement? How were they doing all of this? In this case as well, this is where I put the offensive piece. And by offensive, I have to put in the legal verification, the legal clause, that I don't condone, nor does my company condone any offensive measures against attackers that have in any way, shape, or form attacked your organization. Off the record, as I'm going to show, I definitely go after these individuals, and I pull down C2 content. I get everything I can from them. We'll get into some of that. And as I said before, poking the attackers, and I'll get into that piece too. That's basically just thumbing them in the eye and saying, I'm going to take all your data. And then the last piece is also using the embedded honey documents and the salted documents to gain that data back from the attackers. So the entire idea behind this is everyone can execute a piece of malware in a sandbox and see basic changes to the operating system. Incubation takes that several steps further and lets you understand, ideally, what their motivation is, why they're doing it, what tools they're using, and how they're changing between one organization to the other. In the final phase, this is kind of the soft, touchy phase, it's verification. This is where you start to hopefully attribute attackers, you start to understand groups, and you can start to correlate that to larger methods and larger attack methodologies that these groups are using. This is also reports and all the management crap to make sure that they can pay for it and say this is great stuff. So if we do a comparison between incubation and sandboxing, incubation is a very customized environment, right? It's made to be mimicked and made to mimic an organization. It mimics the targeted environment that these attackers are going after, and it actually reacts to an individual's movement. We'll get into some of that as well going forward. It allows for in-depth recording, logging of the events that were occurring in that environment, not only just on the host, but also on the network itself. It has forensic wonderfulness, and it's free if it's internally developed, right? It's just like sandboxing. The problem with this is it's time intensive, and it's typically costly because it takes a resource to develop this process, and it takes a period of time. Sandboxing, on the other hand, it's freely available, right? Everybody can go out and download CuckooBox for free, and it's a great resource. It mimics the OS level. You can do some application level mimicking, etc. And it allows for some forensic wonderfulness as well. So you can kind of see the difference between the two. So now I want to introduce a tool that I've been developing over about the past 7 months, roughly. It's called Chickenhawk. Where I came up with that name, don't really know, just did one day. Right now, this is the current phase. It supports 16 different country exit nodes. And when I say that, I mean if the attacker goes into one of my virtual environments, compromises the machine, or executes a backdoor, or executes a shell, The exit IP that they're going to see is one of these 16 countries, and you can pick that on the fly. So you essentially, as you're going through and configuring this, you select the country you want, and it will exit out that VPN. It has memory grabbing functions, so if you want to do host-based analysis from anything in memory, you can pull that dynamically. It does automatic VM creation. Right now, I'm supporting 10 operating systems dynamically that can be built, executed, torn down, and continually done over and over, similar to what you'd see in a CuckooBox instance. Right now, I'm supporting Active Directory, database server, web server, and host creation. And by host, I'm talking about just traditional like Windows 7 hosts, Windows XP hosts, etc. It also does automatic account creation based on region. So right now, for those 16 country exit nodes, I have static word lists that if you say I want to exit out Japan and I'm mimicking Toshiba, it will automatically populate Active Directory with static domain names from a static name list that I defined, and will automatically populate and create those Active Directory users. That way, if the attackers come in, they look at the Active Directory tree, they're going to see that there are names there. Are they real? Not necessarily, but ideally it's enough to convince the attacker that they've at least stumbled into something and they're looking at something in greater detail. Syslog and packet capture support as well. So have both of those supports engaged. And host-based off-log host support. So I'm offloading all the logs to a separate host for obvious reasons, so they can't access those. Also, there's host emulation, and by that I mean the domain. It creates an internal domain of RFC 1918 space internally. It has host name, so it defines the host name based on Active Directory server, domain server, etc. It does all of that dynamically. And then an interesting piece is what I call a DPack, or a document pack. This is a dynamic creation utilizing the API from Google Search. What it allows you to do is, if I type in, and I want to mimic Toshiba in Japan, it will actually go out via the Google Search API, pull down documents that are externally facing. They might be sales documents, they might be PDFs, they might be a multitude of anything. Pulls those documents down, compiles them into a document pack, and then sprays them across the environment to make them look like they're being used in a real environment. So in one host it might be under My Downloads, in another host it might be underneath the root of C, who knows. But it sprays it out dynamically to make it look as though these users are actively using these documents. Within those documents, there's a few things. I do beef injection, so for those of you that are familiar, beef is a browser exploitation framework. What that allows you to do is inject JavaScript back to the attacker if they were to execute something that had it embedded. I'll show that going forward. Also, I do POS terminal emulation, so all of the recent malware that you've been hearing about for the payment terminals, payment services, I can emulate a lot of those services now. And then, more importantly too, I'm doing limited SCADA server emulation as well. So there is certain SCADA servers that I'm emulating and software that I'm emulating as well. So we can go forward and say, okay, at least now we can support not just Windows operating systems, not just Linux operating systems, but POS systems and SCADA systems. So let's look at the high-level architecture. On the top, you're going to see that we have the VPN exit node. That's at the very, very top. You have the internet, obviously, sitting below that. Below that, you have what I call the management server, the Chickenhawk management server. That management server is what you do all the configuration from that then pushes out all the config details to the host below it. So you can see below that, you have a file server, web server, Active Directory server, and database server sitting below that, all underneath the management server. From a low-level standpoint, you can see a little bit differently. So the top end is the same, so from the management server up, it's the same. You have a network push that's off to the left, and by network push, I'm saying that's pushing out the network configs across the board. Also, a Honeydocs DPack creation and push occurs off the management server. A host configuration occurs off that server, and the server configuration occurs. So all the configurations that get created get pushed from those 4 modules downward into the hosts. So why would you use incubation? We kind of already covered this a little bit, right? But using it, ideally, helps you get a better understanding of these attackers. And to help showcase that, I've included 3 case studies that show the value behind these. This first case study was attacking ICS companies. They used Havoc's malware. I know a lot of you have probably heard of this recently. They utilized Trojanized software that the ICS providers had. This was first reported public malware utilizing SCADA OPC. And SCADA is, or OPC is a communication protocol being used by SCADA devices. They wanted to find out, and I wanted to find out, what they were doing and why they were doing it. In this case, the attackers leveraged Trojanized ICS software that was on these two websites. There was a few others, but these were the primary two. The VPN had remote access to the products, etc. So everything that these attackers were Trojanizing were tools that people would go out and download and use as real software suites. I utilized that, and I mimicked a large SCADA provider. Can't necessarily say that because I can violate some different things, but I can't say who. It was a Windows 7 SP1 instance, and I had a Matricon OPC server. The host name convention, as you can see, is a company name, and then the server name, and or the company and the host name. So it's not the highest level of emulation, and people are like, well, that's not how, company names their hosts. That's not really the goal. The goal is to have these attackers think that they're in that environment. I had exit nodes in the US and in Germany, and I utilized the DPAC across the environment that sprayed them throughout the entire environment except the OPC server. That can raise some different questions if you're an attacker. And then I ran the Trojanized version of the MB Connect VPN client on that host. The reason I executed that is I was thinking that if I'm the attacker, or if I'm the victim rather, I'm going to open up this VPN software on this host and execute it. And in this case, it's the same thing. I wanted to act like I was a normal person, a normal user in Siemens, executing this VPN software. From a logical perspective, this is what the architecture looked like. You have, obviously, everything from the top end is fine. From the Chickenhawk management server in the middle, you have a device sitting off to your left, which is the Arduino OPC SCADA server. That's a physical device. That I'm not including inside of the Chickenhawk instance. It's a physical device. Then I have an OPC server sitting behind that. And then I have an Active Directory with fake names for that organization also sitting in there. And then I have a business network. That business network is fake, but I wanted to see if these attackers would laterally move into that separate network, or if they could. During the execution of the malware, this might be familiar for some of you as well, an immediate scan for OPC servers within that subnet occurred. So immediately started to scan, and you can start, if you look in here, you don't have to be an OPC expert, but you can see that several hosts are coming out and they're beaconing and saying, yes, we're alive, these OPC servers are there, and we're listening. The malware compiled those results, the scan results from the last slide, into an encrypted file for retrieval later. So they would either retrieve it or exfiltrate this data at a later date. It included a common backdoor for later access, so they could come back at any point they wanted. And then the malware went dormant for 9 hours. So it encrypted the file and essentially went dormant. The attackers gained access after 9 hours back via the backdoor and performed a hostname lookup and IP config. Why they waited that long, I don't know. It's strange that they would have this, open up the back door, and then leave, and then come back 9 hours later. So it was a bit odd. I still can't make much use of that. Then they offloaded that encrypted file that they had performed earlier. And then they uploaded also a network scanning tool. They performed a lateral scan of the network. And what's funny here is that you would think, okay, yeah, they're going to use Nmap. No, they used ZenMap, the Windows version. They didn't even do anything. They literally uploaded ZenMap and ran that. It's kind of weird. And then they offloaded fake documents that appeared to be from the actual company. So I made, again, utilizing that Google DPAC and ran that. I'm still running this as we speak, but it's been silent since. So they offloaded this data. I don't know what they've done with it yet, but it's been silent. They haven't done anything. Attribution of this particular group, as some of you probably have heard, is a group called Energetic Bear. They're a Russian group that like to go after energy companies, ICS providers, etc. That's these guys. They're the ones that are operating, and they're the ones that performed all of these activities. So whenever you go out and you read a blog post and they're talking about Energetic Bear, they're talking about these groups, this is one of the ways that attribution can occur, based on some of the ways that I'm showing you in that. So, the second instance, or the second case study. I mimicked a large POS terminal at a large US retailer. Again, I'm not going to say who. And in this case, I used Windows CE, and I used also a new embedded version of Windows embedded POS 8. I used Micros software, and with Micros, I included default usernames and passwords. I did that, and a lot of people are like, well, that's crap. Why would you do that? It's not even close to secure. Unfortunately, a lot of the POS terminal vendors leave their usernames and passwords as default, like a lot. And in this case, I kept it that way because I wanted to mimic what a true environment looked like. This particular retailer's environment I wanted to mimic. So it has a hostname convention, just like the other one, company, and then the server name, or company and the host name, with exit nodes all in the US. I didn't utilize anything outside the US at this point. I utilized the DPAC again, spraying those documents across the board. And I did dynamic creation of track 1 data, and I put that inside of a Honeydoc. And I'll go into that in just a second. But I took all the fake data, put it inside of a Honeydoc, and then dumped it on the actual Micros POS terminal. Logically, this is what it looks like. On the top, you can see we have the VPN exit node, and then the internet, obviously. You have the actual management server sitting in the middle. From there, I did a configuration push, or a config push, down to the POS RDP server on the left-hand side. I also put on that same server the actual Honeydoc with the fake track 1 data. And then from there as well, I created an Active Directory with fake names that have been salted, as well as a completely separate business network. And again, I really don't put any function on that business network. I create that primarily just to see if the attackers are going to laterally move into that. The Honeydoc piece is an important one, again, because I want to say, by no means do I condone going after the attacker in any fashion. If you do that, that's on your own accord, not on mine or anybody else's. The execution of malware, at that time, it sat dormant for 27 minutes. So executed the malware in the fake environment, sat for 27 minutes. At 27 minutes, it beaconed out to 2 IPs. Immediate login attempts started directly at that 27.5-minute mark. Immediate login attempts. So usernames and passwords, all for default credentials. Surprise, surprise. Attackers made 4 logins, true 4 valid logins. And from there, they ranged from 4 seconds to 7 minutes, all 4 of those. So the first login was a very short period of time. It's 4 seconds. And then it went from there, all the way up to 7 minutes. The most notable was the actual offloading of the Honeydoc that was containing the track 1 data. So on the last access attempt, it was 7 minutes long. They did some additional poking around, nothing really out of the ordinary, but then they offloaded that Honeydoc off to a different IP. They accessed the track 1 data on their host server. So on one of their C2s, 62.109.16.195, they accessed it on that machine. So right there, that tells me something, that these attackers are going out, pulling data from their victims, and then they're opening them on their actual C2, which from an OPSEC standpoint, that's really, really stupid. You definitely shouldn't do that. You offload your stuff from the C2 and then open it locally. But they weren't, which made it great for me.
What country is that?
Which one? The 62? I don't know. Somebody with connection, who is it? Huh? So from that, whenever they opened that actual document, it gave me shell back, and I accessed their internally hosted command panels for their malware. So their C2 panels weren't externally accessible. So I couldn't just go out via HTTP and hit them like you can most attackers. In this case, once I got in, I went in via localhost, accessed the actual control panel, and you can see a screenshot of the control panel there, and that's a listing of their victims and a lot of other Russian that I don't know off the top of my head. But from there, I was able to access who the victims were, how long they were accessed, what these attackers were doing to those specific victims that were on that control panel. So you can see that that's a failure on their end, because if they would have opened it on their internal network from the C2, there's a high likelihood I wouldn't have been able to access that command panel. So that's kind of an OPSEC failure on their standpoint. So if we look at the exfiltrated timeline, I built this out based on a time frame of access. And I did this because it's interesting to note the times in which they were active. This is KSM local time, so this isn't central time, this isn't in the States. But you can see they became active at 3 p.m. their time, and were active till 9 p.m. And by active, I don't mean they were inside for that entire period. They came in for 4 seconds, came out, went back in, came out, went back in. So during that entire process, this is what it spread out to look like. So with this data, I can start to carve out how long are these attackers consistently gaining access to these machines, and for what data are they exfiltrating, how much, right? And if you start to build that out, then I can start to draw correlation lines with groups from there too. So the next logical question is, who is this? Unfortunately, I don't know. I can't answer that. I don't know who the groups are yet, and I don't know who the, yep.
The IP that you showed comes up as Russia.
Yeah.
It comes up in a FireEye article.
Yeah, which the article was one that I wrote. Yeah.
We actually see, I've seen that we're working at university.
Okay.
We see a lot of that, especially from the RBN versus network.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's on our list of things that
You mean that IP or?
within that sort of block.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a common, unfortunately, that's not the only POS malware I've seen come from there, nor is it the only family of malware. I've seen other families of malware come from that same sitter before. This one isn't necessarily, what makes this one different is what, in that FireEye article that I had written with another author, it's called Brute POS. And it's one that we found a month and a half ago, I think, is when we published that article. And that specific variant of POS malware just utilizes brute forcing. It's super, like, skid stuff, like it's bad. Like, they literally just hard code usernames and passwords, and they dump it out there, and if it hits, great. If not, it sucks. But what's interesting is they are very active, and they're very successful. That's just one control panel. There was multiple control panels beyond that one that we accessed. So they're very active, but and unfortunately, as lame as their malware and their techniques are, unfortunately, it's very, very successful. It's very successful for whatever reason. Now for the third case study. These were attacks reported against a European financial intelligence firm in conferences. So this is actually an financial intelligence conference that they're targeting the actual individuals within the conference. And we'll get into some of that. The malware was hosted at, and I omitted the last piece because I don't know if I was able to put that or not. If you do a little bit of virus total searching, you'll find it pretty quick, I think. It was the typical CVE 2012-0158, so the same targeted CVE crap that every targeted attacker uses still. And it dropped poison ivy. The particular instance in this case was I mimicked the large financial intelligence conference in London, so I mimicked this actual conference. They don't know this, so if they watch this video, which I doubt they will, but if they do, there's a high likelihood I'll get in trouble for this, I don't know. I mimicked a /24 business network, so just a straight, flat 24 network, nothing crazy. I did Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows Server 2008, and I did, again, in this case, fake account creations with Active Directory. So went out, created that, just like anywhere else. I put the only exit node was in the UK. This is a UK conference, so I made it out of the UK. Then I created a DPAC, sprayed the documents across the environment, and I did a honey document drop in 2 different Excel documents throughout the environment. The idea being that if they pick up a document in one place, they may not in another. So I wanted to make sure I spread my luck out elsewhere. I spread my luck out universally throughout the environment. So I dropped 2 different ones. Logically, this is what it looks like. Logically, you can see again, normal VPN exit node, internet sitting behind it. I utilize the same concepts, right? Nothing too out of the ordinary here. You can see that the honey document dropped on the bottom left on the file server itself, as well as the Active Directory server and the web server. So you can see there's, ideally, every time you go through this incubation process, it's not going to change dramatically throughout each instance. What will change, obviously, are host names, RC19 space, 1918 space, those types of things likely will change, but that really should only be it. During the execution of the malware, I opened up the 2012-0158 document on one of the actual servers, the file server in this case. I opened up the document, and then it beaconed out immediately to 3 different IPs, or 3 different URLs in this case. If you want to go out and have some fun, go out, write those down, and go out and look around for those. You can pivot off of that stuff for days. Those are good ones. And then it's just the standard poison ivy payload with this password, very standard. I mean, that's a very standard poison ivy password, nothing special there. And then I watched attackers exfiltrate what they thought was supposed conference information, materials, over a 12-hour time frame. And what was in those Excel documents was the same. I used this different named account or different named document template, and I just dumped a bunch of usernames into that Excel document, making it look as though it was conference attendees. So these attackers at this point were interested in who the conference attendees were and not necessarily in anything else about them. Oftentimes what we'll see is these attackers will exfiltrate this conference list, the idea. So everybody in this room, for instance, they would take that, and then they'd individually go out and look at people of interest. So they'd find out what your title is, et cetera, and then they would target you more specifically with some shittily made spear phishing document or something like that. So they would target you differently individually as they go through, but the first step is to take all the conference attendees. And again, in this case, they focus primarily on the attendees and not the content within the conference. From an exfiltrated data standpoint, this is what we're looking at. There's not a terrible amount over a long period of time. This is in CST, China Standard Time. And they were active for 2 hours, and this was locally. So they're lunchtime workers, apparently. They like to work during lunch, but every other time, they don't do much, I guess. Yeah, so I guess they eat at their desk. I don't know. So 12 p.m. and 1 p.m., that's whenever they were exfiltrating data. The rest of the time was quiet. I'm still incubating this. I don't expect to see much, and I haven't. But I'm not expecting to see much beyond this. From an attribution standpoint, who is it? It's a team called 338, and I know some of you are probably familiar with who these guys are. Again, they're very familiar with poison ivy. They enjoy using poison ivy. They like financial institutions, et cetera. Nothing too crazy there. So now, this is the final slide. What I typically do is I'm going through the going forward and then open it up for questions and answers. I've noticed that this talk, oftentimes, there is a lot of questions and answers just because it is more architecturally driven. So going forward, what's kind of the idea? I want to do additional application versioning support. I want to have additional application support, not just versioning, but also the applications themselves. I want to be able to support automatic digital forensics program execution. So whenever the malware fires off, it automatically starts to go through automated forensic processing. So that way it takes out some of the manual intervention that you have to do. And then additional logging support as well. And I plan on making this open source available on October 25th of this year. Now, that's a few things that you won't be able to use is my Google API, so you have to get your own. It's free. So your Google Search API, you will have to get your own. And then VMs, obviously. But other than that, everything else will be included.
Hello, I'm Geek here. I'm not quite sure what happened with this part of the clip. I think someone either unplugged the microphone or a battery ran out someplace. But the audio starts up again a little bit after 35 minutes into the video, so not long from now. Sorry for the problems.
Yeah. It's just manual intervention, really. As far as ensuring that type of stuff, do you mean from whenever I access them, or do you mean what do you? Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just manual, really. It's going out and looking at my systems manually and making sure that nothing of that sort has come into the network. And a lot of that stems from making sure that the DPAC, or the document pack from the Google API search, is properly pulling data down. I don't want to be pulling down things that don't exist. So I'm only crawling specific directories and certain depths within those directories of the organization that I'm mimicking. So that's really the big part that I'm very weary of, is during the pull down process. I don't want to be pulling anything down, obviously, that is something like that. No image files, no anything like that. It's just, in that case, yeah, unless you're embedding it in a Word document or something, because right now I'm supporting PDF, Word, CSV, and literally 10 or 15 different document types.
Those are the documents that we're mimicking.
Precisely.
The ones that you let them upload.
Exactly.
There was a question, why are you letting them upload? Just immutables, anything else?
No, anything else. So once they gain access to the systems, I let them do anything that they want as though they were an attacker, because that was my point, is to be able to watch what they're doing and to be able to perform the intelligence on whatever they're doing. So if they upload exes, that's fine. I want to get those. If they upload, whatever they upload, I'm monitoring. What's that?
You don't want them to upload JPEGs. Just an observation. Just talk about CP.
Yeah. I mean, it's, from an upload standpoint, I let them do whatever they want. If they upload kiddie porn, I'll get law enforcement involved. I haven't had that happen. Most of the time, I mean, I'm dealing with state-sponsored entities, so I'm not really dealing with anybody that ideally is in that environment. But if I do, that's something where I get law enforcement involved. But as far as me pulling down documents and data from a DPAC, that's something that I control very, very closely. I don't pull down JPEGs. I don't do those types of things. But from an actor's approach, that's something they can upload JPEGs if they want.
Are you going to go live with them? Are you going to provide like guidance to creating the I mean, not creating, but creating your DPAC?
Yeah. Actually, all that's going to be included. So the DPAC creation, all that script is going to be included. So the only things that you would need to have at that point is your own Google Search API and your own VMs. I'm not going to turn over my VMs, obviously, for licensing issues, but that's the only thing that you would need to do, is provide your own API and your own VMs. All the other stuff, as far as creating the DPACs, doing all of that, that's all going to be included.
How much time do you spend mimicking each environment to scale well?
Scaling, ideally by 1025, is going to scale very well. Right now, it is a fairly manual process. Not spinning up the VMs, spinning them down, tearing them up, tearing them down. That's quick. It's just more of the fact of, okay, if it's a /24, that's something that you do have to touch. Right now, I centralized the logging. That was the first step. Ideally, the second step by 1025 is going to be the more scalable model. So right now, I'm getting there. I'll put it that way. Yeah.
Okay, 2 questions. First off, I guess kind of piggyback on that. How long did it take you to set up these different cases, like POS line? How long did it take?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So the POS stuff, I was going through and developing it at the time as well. So it wasn't a true, I spun it up. So that might not be a good case study. But during the process, whenever I was developing the actual POS to repurpose, et cetera, going through it, that was about a 2-hour process. That includes developing. To spin up just a straight, for the case study 3, where you're talking just, few hosts, et cetera, that's in about 10 to 15 minutes tops. So you can really tear it up, tear it down within 15 minutes. Now, keeping in mind, that's one instance. If you start to multiply the instances that you're running at any given time, obviously that's going to be a lot more intensive on CPUs, et cetera. But a single instance you can fire up with a limited amount, like case study 3, in about 15 minutes on average.
And the second one, this may be a Google API.
Sure.
When you're using DPAC down, is there a way to control dates, time frame, maybe what you're pulling down?
There is. My script doesn't support that right now. It is a very easy implementation. Mine is very broad. So if it's Sony, for instance, like Sony.com, it would start to crawl directories and subdirectories under Sony. And then also, to a certain degree, other domains that are off of Sony, subdomains, et cetera. But I don't have it doing anything as far as date carving, anything like that. That is something you certainly can do. I just haven't, honestly, needed to do that yet. Yeah.
Did you look at, instead of reading the book, did you look at like Boca or something like that?
What? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
For gathering the documents.
Yeah. I use Google API just because, honestly, it took, a matter of a couple minutes to get the API and to code it to do what I needed to do. And to be able to spray that very quickly.
What does that API do exactly?
So the Google API, whenever it goes out and interfaces directly with Google, it will perform dynamic search for the content, whatever you specify. So in this case, if you enter in Sony, it will go out based on the criteria that you've developed the API to pull, and it will actually go out and start to pull whatever it is that you specify in your script. And this,
Are you emulating like the internal search server?
I'm not emulating, at this point, I'm not emulating anything. It's completely functional, meaning the reasoning that I'm using this is to pull the documents down. I'm not using it to emulate. I don't expect the attackers to see any of this. Does that make sense? I'm expecting the attackers to see the end result.
Document distribution piece.
Yeah, that's the document distribution piece. They won't see any of that. I don't care. The attacker shouldn't see any of that. That's purely functional. Whenever the documents get pulled down and I spray them, the purpose is, the end goal is for the attacker to see the document that's on that directory. Bingo. They won't see anything like that. They'll only see the document on the host that I put there via the API. But they won't see any of the search functions. They won't see anything from that script. Yep. That's correct, yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's a good question. So keep in mind that this isn't like a traditional honeypot. So this isn't like external facing and just drive by and the attacker gains access to it. This is, you execute the malware within the environment, ideally knowing who they were attacking, who they were targeting, et cetera. So you execute it in that controlled environment, and that's how you can track the TTPs of that particular actor in that case. So yes, that's correct. You have to execute it in that environment, and it is controlled, obviously, but it's not external facing, so you're not waiting for drive-bys or anything like that. Hmm? Yeah, so right now I don't have anything in AWS, EC2, nothing like that. Right now I'm running it all on physical hardware. Ideally, it would be great to obviously migrate that to be able to spin up and spin down. I'm hoping by 1025 I can do that. That's really kind of the scalable conversation, is really if I can get it to go to that route, then it should be very scalable and very quick. No, these are VMs that I'm issuing direct commands via the VM command line, so I'm actually creating them dynamically just internally, though. I'm not doing anything out to EC2. Correct, yeah. It's on my own virtualization platform. It's nothing out on EC2, nothing like that. Well, yeah, it's a combination, but primarily it's Zen. So. Yeah, so keep in mind again that I'm not necessarily, I'm emulating the country of exit. I'm not emulating like Sony address space. I can't, that's not possible, right? So I can't emulate that. What I can do is, in one case, there was a large Japanese manufacturing company. I was mimicking not their IP space, but the exit node of that country, meaning in Japan. Precisely. That's exactly right, yeah. So, I mean, there are certain things that I can't emulate, right? And IP space, the external IP space is one thing of that. So at that point, the closest I can get is having the external IP be an exit point in Japan and not, in US, not something like that. Yeah, I'd love that, yeah. If there's anybody in here that's willing to do that, I'd love to take it. I've considered that, but unfortunately for that, it was going to take some more monetary backing for me to be able to do that. That is something. Hey, if anybody wants to provide me with IP space for free too, I'll take that. But I mean, honestly, it's a great, to look upstream at who their providers are would be awesome. But it does take, it would take money. And, from my aspect too, I'm looking at it as I'm just a one guy doing it. So whenever I spin up a VPN IP, I'm just taking any IP, there's really no configs, I'm just kind of spinning it up, popping out a VPN, and there it is. And there is some of that too that I think some of the actors have gone out and they've realized this isn't, Toshiba, it's not their IP address space. And others I'm sure have done that and they realize, okay, well it might be a home worker, it might be somebody at home working and, whatever. So it is something that would be cool to go down, just I haven't gone down that path yet.
How do you make sure that they don't track it back to you?
So with the company that I work at now, we have a lot of access options for worldwide VPNs that are not, I don't pay for them. We have access in multiple countries, so I'm piggybacking on that for our research infrastructure at that point. But none of it ties back to me.
You're using some VPN access for your
That's correct.
civilian environment.
Yep, that's exactly right.
And they don't necessarily point to you or to your company.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Have you used Tor?
Wha-
Are you using Tor?
I have. The main idea was there that Tor is only good, for the browser level. I wanted to be able to make sure that from the network level, if they were on the machine and they actually wanted to look at the external IP, they would actually see it as a true external IP and not a Tor IP or an IP going out through HTTP on Tor. So, that's something that I've considered, but I'm looking at, I want 100% traffic to exit from that VPN exit node in that country. But Tor was something that I went down the path of at the very beginning.
Is
But
that something that would be possible in the release?
It's possible. I mean, for the release date, my primary concern is making it scalable, getting it out to EC2, and being able to do dynamic spin-ups and spin-downs. I can definitely put that on a list, though, but I don't know how much, I don't know if I'll be able to by 1025, put it that way. But I can definitely put it in as a quote-unquote feature request.
I think that would be great if we have everybody in this room spinning up one of these, one of these tiny pods and then giving you the data or publishing the data.
Yeah.
Great advance.
Yep. So we have time for about one more question, if anybody. Yeah. Yeah. No, other than the DPACs, there's really not much. So ideally what I was doing was whenever I push out the DPACs and whenever I create the fake domain, the fake names within the Active Directory, at that point, that's really where I drew the line. And I said, okay, that's going to be really it. I'm playing with the idea of having dynamic feedback, meaning that if they make a change, then there is some dynamic feedback that could change. I haven't really decided on a good method to go forward, but hopefully once I go open source with this, other people can start to contribute cool stuff like that, and that would start to enhance it some. So, all right. Well, I appreciate it, everyone. I'm going to be around for a minute. So. Hold on. It's 11 or 12:50, so I'll come over and talk in just a second. Thanks.